thought of an idea, I think the next step is to figure out how to validate it. So what you think is true isn't necessarily the absolute truth of the world. So like, for example, if you have an idea for a product, the most important thing you should probably try and figure out is who would want to pay for it, or like who would the users be. So whoever you think the users would be, like, oh, like, moms in Nebraska would love this like app idea I have. Or like, you need to talk to moms in Nebraska about it, right? So like for us, we had this idea for a collaboration tool for clinicians, and guess how we figured out whether they'd wanted it? We talked to lots and lots of doctors. We talked to ones at UCSF, at Mayo, at Kaiser, like everyone that we could really get a hold of. We had a lot of questions around the platform. So like, will patients accept doctors wearing Google Glass? Like, will all these various types of people want to wear Google Glass? We put Google Glass on nurses, on physician's assistants, on rehabilitation experts, on neurosurgeons, on cardiac surgeons, like every single person we could figure out, okay, what's the acceptance like, right? And we learned a lot of things, right? So we learned that there's a lot of just design considerations that we figured out after we realized, okay, this is the range of the type of provider who would be wearing Google Glass, right? And then on the same side, on the interface that we made for experts, okay, this is the type of expert who's going to be looking at a video feed or media from an operator, and this is what they're going to expect to see. Like, how exactly do you create that interaction, and okay, what's the security requirement? So when you're just starting out with an idea, you really just need to talk to the people who would be using it and make sure that your intuitions about what they want are actually what they want. And probably the hardest thing, at least for me, coming into it was trying to figure out, like, okay, what exactly is the business model behind this? I think that's something that is like boring and like not exciting to do, that I think people usually neglect to do much later on, especially now that like there's all these applications that, they don't actually make money for a long time. And so people are like, okay, I don't have to think about business model, but that's just, I don't think that's the case. I think you do need to think very deeply about like, what are your operational expenses? Like, who are you going to have to hire? How much is that going to cost? How are you going to pay for that? And kind of orienting the activities that you're doing around either figuring out how you're going to bring on team members. So like, how are you going to attract talent, whether that's engineers or whether that's, salespeople, whether that's operations people? What do you have to do now to like get those people interested? And then similarly, like if that's not your most important issue, like maybe your most important issue is how to attract investment. So then you have to orient yourselves around thinking like a VC or thinking like an angel, and think about, okay, what does an angel need to see to like be able to give me money right now? So, I think you have to kind of think about all these aspects about like whether your most important priority right now is building the product, whether the most important priority right now is getting a product in the customer's hands, whether your most important priority is like attracting an engineer to work with you, or whether your most important priority is to like attract investment to hire more engineers. So you kind of have to figure out the sequencing of this, and like being really deliberate and disciplined about that sequencing is hard, and that's like why startups fail and like why it takes a long time to like build something valuable. I think the best thing to do is like to find people who you admire or trust, or you think you have accomplished things that you don't know how to accomplish, and talk to them about your problems. So like specifically for me, I talk to people who've like worked in software who've like sold software as a service, like exited companies, people who worked in healthcare, who either like healthcare IT, like sold, like either like building like a base of clinicians, or like I talked to people who were solving various aspects of the problem that we were trying to solve. And it's also really helpful to talk to like entrepreneurs your own age, because they're also like, I guess, equally inexperienced. So it's kind of refreshing or maybe validating to see them kind of struggle in the same ways that you struggle. But I wouldn't spend too much time talking to them, because they also don't know as much about what they're doing. You should probably spend more time talking to people, who have a great track record, who, sold their company, or their company is profitable, or, for whatever reason, or they're where you want to be. So the very first step was, getting Google Glass. We started out and it hadn't been released, and we didn't know anyone to be able to get it. So the first step was getting Google Glass, understanding what the platform was like. How do you develop technologies on this? Like, what is the device capable of? What's the battery life? Just like really basic stuff about like understanding the platform. Then after we gotten a better sense of that, I think the thing we focused on was getting feedback from clinicians. So, for example, my co-founder definitely led that effort. She went to the University of Pennsylvania's medical school, so we talked to the CIO, the CFO, chief innovation officer, chief financial officer at these hospitals. We talked to people who've implemented like tele-ICU, like telemedicine in intensive care units in hospitals. We talked to a lot of clinicians who'd already rolled out technology at their institutions. And then we talked specifically to doctors who would be using the product and like what use cases they'd want to use it in. And then I probably spent more time talking to like Siemens and Cisco and like people who built like legacy solutions to try and get an understanding of, okay, what's the pricing for this, right? Like, what does the cost structure look like? How do they sell to hospitals? What does an enterprise sale look like? What is software as a service? Like, how do all of these things work? Like, what does like security look like? How do you encrypt things? Like, what does it mean to store something in transit and at rest? Like, what are all these requirements that they're talking about? What is a business associates agreement? Like, kind of like understanding basics of like how a sale would work and what a deployment of our product would look like and what existing solutions already have been made and why those existing solutions aren't good enough, or like what is better about our product that we could offer that's differentiated. Yeah, and then so in that process, obviously you have to start like building like alpha and like beta versions of your product. So we built out some like alpha versions and beta versions of our product. We had clinicians test it. They gave us feedback. We were like, okay, let's change these things about it. So we did that. And then there's like all these technological challenges around like, okay, how do you get video to stream on this device with all these battery constraints and these like Wi-Fi constraints? And then it's like, okay, like should you use a third-party service or should you build your own? I mean, I don't know. These are like, I think, not interesting details, but I think the point is that like you just have to figure out like a feedback loop around trying to get your product from like not that good to like medium good to okay, pretty decent to like sellable. And depending on like what market you're going after, it's like either easy or hard. So like healthcare, I would say, is probably hard because there's just a lot of barriers to entry. We had like the chief of surgery at Harvard really excited about our product, and even with such a strong champion who's like a bull in a china shop, it took 2 months just to get through paperwork, through IT, through risk compliance, to getting buy-in from all the stakeholders who are going to be operators, who are going to be experts. Yeah, it takes like things just kind of take a long time to get through. Usually when I'm feeling like really burned out or like not really hard line, like this is going to happen, I usually just sleep for like 12 to 14 hours and I'll feel better after. I mean, that's an extremely honest answer, but like I guess other things that like work for people might be talking to people who your product is reaching. Like if you've gotten to the stage where people are using your product, it feels really good to just talk to them and be like, hey, so like, do you care about this at all? Like, is this improving your life? Like, is this like, help, like if you're a doctor, like is this helping you use less time to like care for your patients? Do you feel more connected to them? All of these things. Like, I think at the end of the day, everyone who starts a company or builds a product really cares about their users. So if you talk to them about how what you've built has affected them, I think that's extremely motivating for anyone starting a company. I mean, there's like lots of feeling lost just around like what should the product be, or like who should we approach for investment, or like how should we find engineers, or I mean, I feel like any company, there's like basic fundamental stuff that you'll just feel lost about. So there's lots of points where you'll feel lost or feel like you're failing. I don't really know what to say about that other than that, like I said, I think the most important thing about like starting a company or like having confidence in yourself is that you have to decide at some point that it's going to succeed no matter what. And a failure or feeling lost is like a hiccup in that, and you have to talk to the people who are supporting you, whether that's those are investors or your employees if it's appropriate, or just like other people who you ask for help or for guidance about what you're feeling, because I think the worst thing is probably when you feel isolated and you feel like no one else has felt this way, or like your situation is so unique. The reality is that like lots of people, I guarantee, have always felt exactly what you're feeling right now. So just really remembering that like you're not the only one, or your circumstance isn't unique, is actually pretty liberating, because they're just like, okay, so that means like other people have gotten through this, and that means that like other people struggle with the same things, whether it's like, you don't feel like you're good enough in whatever way, or you don't feel like you have the right channels to distribute your product, or whatever it is. The point is that like other people have felt the same way and have continued to succeed and build great companies. So there are 4 people on our team right now. my co-founder, who's on the clinical side, our engineer, and I guess 2 people are like part-time. One is does design and one is engineering. My co-founder is actually my sister. So she, after her 4th year of medical school, I spoke to her about this, and she's similarly like had worked in hospitals and had seen technology fail miserably, and was like, yeah, like we should definitely try and fix this. So she came on board and is like putting her residency and things like that on pause to work on this company. And engineers have just been kind of like friends of ours. So like, currently we're working with someone who's my friend who we convinced to leave Goldman Sachs engineering to like work on our product. And yeah, I mean, like just think about it, like whenever you're trying to do something ridiculous, you kind of have to think, okay, who would want to do this with me? Like, whose interests are aligned to do this, right? So there's like lots of incentives for why you want to join a startup. Like, you really want to build something that no one else has ever built before. So like, there's certain people who that really appeals to. There are certain people who like a huge exit really appeals to. So like, okay, like I'm going to offer you this much equity, and like our valuation is we're going to have like a 6 million cap, so like that equity is worth this amount right now, and if we get this Series A or the Series B, or we have this exit, like look how much that equity would be worth. Like some people are really motivated by the financial incentive, other people are really motivated by the team. So if you bring on lots of like really smart, talented people who have like a really interesting culture, some people like really would thrive in that environment. So that's something you can use to like bring people on. And I think the 4th thing is probably mission, right? So like, what's your company mission? What's your company goal? It has to resonate with people because, right after the financial incentive is gone, which is you're going to give away a lot of your equity to like your co-founders, people have to want to join because they share this vision with you. I think actually Peter Thiel asked this really good question, which is how are you going to get the 20th person to join your company? Because it's like, okay, it's no longer prestigious because you're not going to be a co-founder or like a first engineer. And you would be paid more if you worked at like, Google or Apple. So, why is that 20th person going to come onto your company? And I think that it's pretty well tied to what your vision is and like how well articulated you've described this is the future that we can create and this is why. Like your time is better. It's like I said, like when you're starting a company, you have to think about what's a space where you have an unfair advantage where your time is being highest leveraged. Similarly, like everyone who joins your company should feel like their time is highest leveraged at your company. They should feel like because of the resources that you've brought to the table and because of the distribution networks that you've figured out or the product that you've created, like they are spending their time best. They are making the most impact in the world. They're helping the most people by sitting at their desk every day or like being out in the field or like coding or whatever it is they're doing for you. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely costs associated with like changing what you're working on. Like that's your job, I guess, as a founder or as a leader, is to try and figure out like what's the most efficient path to like getting your product deployed or like getting your user base or like whatever your end game is. Like your job as a founder is to try and find the most efficient path there. So yeah, weigh the costs and benefits. Do a little T-chart. I don't know. I think it's a really good question to think about. Like how long do you pursue like a specific execution strategy single-mindedly, and I think about this as you're either like heads down or you're like above ground and you're like thinking about other things. So I think that it's really important to like be heads down about something for some specific amount of time that you agree on with like your co-founder and your team, and you say, hey, for 2 weeks we're really going to try and talk to only like surgeons. Like we're only going to talk to surgeons about this one use case that we want to pursue, and we're going to be just dead focused on that. And I think that it's kind of like you're oscillating between breadth and depth. So depth is what happens when you go heads down, and then breadth is what happens when you pick your head up and you say, okay, like we talked to a lot of surgeons, we got this certain feedback, but like I'm really curious about like what ophthalmologists think. I'm really curious about like what someone else thinks. So and then again capping that time, saying, okay, we're going to spend 2 days thinking about other directions that we can go in, and then we're going to go heads down again, and we're going to focus on something. So I think it depends on what your circumstances, but it's really important to get both breadth and depth, and to decide on an execution strategy for a long enough time where you can actually see it through. Because I mean, there's no point of like half-assing something, right? So if you only half-ass an execution strategy, you don't know, you didn't accomplish anything. You don't know whether you failed or succeeded. So you need to like commit to it for a fixed amount of time where you can actually assess whether it failed or succeeded, and then it does make sense to based on that binary assessment, if it is binary, to say, okay, it failed, so like I'm going to think about it again and like pursue something else. This is like the most important skill of life, is to be able to figure out how to learn quickly and learn things you don't understand. I almost think that this is something you have to kind of tackle emotionally more than mentally. I feel like people are smart and sponges, but I think a lot of times people can't emotionally get over the fact that like they don't know something critical to like their company, or like they feel like it's a feeling, right? Like they feel like something's too hard to learn. Nothing is magic, right? Like people get really intimidated by engineers, but like nothing engineers do is magic or insurmountable or impossible to understand. Like read a couple of books and you'll understand it. Like you become competent in anything that you dedicate your time to. So if you decide you want to dedicate your time to like learning the piano, you'll become a great pianist. If you decide you want to dedicate your time to like understanding like database structures or like arrays, then you'll become really good at that. So I think the biggest thing is that people are afraid to dedicate time to things, and they're afraid to fail at things, and they're afraid to understand that like anything worth valuable, anything worth doing takes a long time. So people always are like, okay, like get rich quick, or like what can I get done, and like what can I sprint toward? But like life isn't like that. Life isn't a sprint. Life is a marathon. If you want something that's hard to get, then you need to be willing to put in the work to do it. So yeah, I don't think that there's, if you want to learn something, then just go out and learn it. There's like a million resources for how to learn it. There's, and I also really don't think that people need hand-holding. Like you don't really need a mentor, or you don't really need like some expert to teach it to you. At the end of the day, like if you're, whether you're in college or whether you're, in high school or however you want to learn something, if you think about the times in your life, I mean, this is only true for me, but it might be true for you. When I think about the hardest things I've ever learned, no one was ever standing over my shoulder, badgering me to learn it, or like explaining to me how to do it. I just kept reading or kept thinking about it and like convinced myself that I would understand it, and then eventually I did. So I don't know, I think maybe I'm being too hard on like myself or other people, but I think that people have a personal responsibility to try and learn things, and like however you want to be motivated, whether that's through like wanting to build something and knowing that like this piece of information that you don't understand is key to building it, and if that's what motivates you to like fill in the gap, then maybe that's what it is. Or maybe you really want to teach someone else something and you have to understand it first. Like however you want to motivate yourself, do that, but you should just remember that nothing is impossible to learn, and you just have to dedicate a certain amount of time to it and be deliberate about it, and you can understand or get whatever competency you don't have. The Thiel Fellowship is this really one-of-a-kind opportunity where Peter Thiel, he founded PayPal, invested in Facebook, now he's a venture capitalist. He picks 20 entrepreneurs under 20 and allows them the freedom to kind of work on whatever problem they want to work on, and gives them $100K seed funding to kind of get that going. The interview process was like probably one of the best weekends of my life, I'd say. They bring together these 40 finalists. They look at all the applications. They bring together 40 finalists. And for me, it was the first time I'd felt such synchrony and resonance with my peers before. I just met all these people who cared deeply about what they were working on, really believed that they could make it happen, and had done crazy, incredible things that I'd never even even started to think about doing before. And they were really inspiring. They really motivated me. I really admired a lot of them, and that's kind of when I decided that okay, this is definitely the program for me. But yeah, the process specifically was you interview with the foundation, and you interview with other fellows, you interview with other mentors, and you pitch your idea to investors and media and the foundation as well, and you get feedback on it. Yeah, so there's a mentor community. You kind of reach out to them based on what their expertise is and what you're trying to learn. There's a newsletter where you'll explain kind of how you're progressing every month. They'll be hey, it's what's going on, what's your progress, what are your difficulties, and they kind of use that as a way to gauge how to bring resources to you, or how to kind of move forward there. There's not a curriculum per se. The way that you measure, you kind of decide how you want to measure your success or failure. You say okay, in a month I want to have 50 users, or I want to have a product deployed, or I want to give this talk, or I want to write this book, or whatever it is you want to do, and you kind of decide for yourself where you want to be in a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, and you you kind of have to figure out how to structure and like measure your own success. I think that was one of the I think best learning experiences for me. Is like in school it was like such a structured environment, and like it was impossible to fail. Like you can fail at a test, but like you really can't like fail at school. Like I don't know. I just think school is like it's really hard to fail. Like you're kind of like you're given like these lessons and these tests piecemeal, and it's just like if you just consume it, you'll like kind of get an A at the end. I don't know. School was like never like super like challenging. Like for me personally, but I was also like at the same time kind of really into it. Like it's kind of like like a hamster wheel. Like it's like you're spinning on a hamster wheel. It's like you feel like you're making all this progress, like you're learning all this stuff, but you're kind of like moving in circles. Not to say I didn't learn a lot of like awesome things in school. It's just that you are spoon-fed it, and once you remove that structure, you realize how beneficial that structure is in a lot of ways, right? Because if you do make this incremental progress every day, but you also realize that you don't know how to replicate that for yourself for your own goals, right? So like someone else can tell you that like I'm gonna teach you calculus in a semester, and like they'll take care of all the structures around it, and like you'll be able to learn at the end of that. But I almost think it's much more valuable to figure out how would you be able to teach yourself calculus. Like how do you motivate yourself to work on that every day? Like how do you figure out like what the content is that you need to learn? And maybe that's like overly difficult, but just the idea of like creating your own structure is something that any startup founder has to do, and something you have to do as soon as you get out of school. And I think that you learn, at least me, like I learned a lot about myself by being out of school and like trying to work on my own thing, because basically all of your greatest weaknesses are amplified when you're not inside of a structure, right? So in a structure, you're forced to do a lot of things, and a lot of those things are good, right? Like you have to wake up at a certain time, you have to start working on these classes. There's like a lot of like social enforcement, things are due at a certain time, like people will ask you where they are, and right. So you learn a lot about like what your own weaknesses are when you're outside of that structure. And yeah, and then you also learn, okay, how do I adjust for these weaknesses that I have? Basically, my entire life, I'd always been looking for a community of people who cared about the same things that I did, and who wanted to accomplish kind of things at a similar scale that I wanted to accomplish. And my entire life, I was like certain I'd find that in college. And as a senior, I applied to college, obviously, and I applied to the fellowship. And at the finalist weekend, I was just sold. Like I'd never met a group of people who I had such synchrony with, and I'd never been to a place so beautiful like San Francisco. It was like breathtaking, and had never been in a community that was so supportive. And the idea I originally applied with and like started working on was like completely unfeasible on like many different levels. And like the fact that like people, regardless of like that fact now, we're still like trying to kind of like hash through it with me and like kind of explain to me like how it could potentially work, or like how like different iterations of that idea was really valuable, right? And I don't know whether I would have been able to get that. And I don't know if I would be able to get that in university or anywhere else. One thing I definitely learned is that, so I guess it kind of goes along the lines of like the reality that actually exists and the reality that you want to exist. So similarly, I remember when I kind of came out to the Bay Area, I was really starstruck by a lot of people that I met, because I'd seen like glossy magazine covers of them. I'd seen them give these polished talks, and I was just completely like floored and impressed with them, and felt like there's no way I could ever be like that, because the image that had been portrayed of them in the media literally was fake. Like it was manufactured. Like it's not what they're actually like. And it was really refreshing and great to, when I actually met them, to see that, okay, like they have bags under their eyes, they stutter, they like make mistakes, like they have frizzy hair or whatever too, and they're not as perfect as like they're perceived to look like, and their story isn't as pristine as everyone describes it, right? Like it wasn't like, oh, like they went to Harvard and then they went to Stanford and then they fell into this awesome job and their startup immediately was successful. Like that's like a story that's like very easy to tell in like a paragraph, but that's just not actually the story that they actually went through. And at least for me, like that validated a lot of like kind of like this, the rockiness or the turmoil that I was going through. And it made me realize that there's like just a dichotomy between reality that actually exists and the complexity around what it takes to actually like launch a company and like start something that's valuable. Like for example, like Palantir, for example, it took them like 3 years and like $30 million to build a product that was valuable, right? So like again, like anything worth doing is hard. It takes 3 years, it takes $30 million to like build something, right? And like that's not true. It doesn't require like not every startup requires like that amount of money, that amount of time to like build something valuable. But basically the stories that I'd always been told my entire life about like what entrepreneurship was like or like what it took to build a company, I realized were oversimplified and that there's more nuance to that. And I've experienced that nuance personally, and I've also like understood what that nuance is from people who are much older than me. And I think that going along this lines, there's a really fundamental intuition that I had when I was in high school, which was that when I went back to Pakistan, where I'm from, I saw like extremely poor people, just extremely poor, but they looked exactly like me, right? Like, because I'm from there, and I think I was like 12 years old, and there were these like 12-year-old girls who were like super skinny and like were on the street, and like no one was taking care of them, and I was like, she literally looks exactly like me. Like, this is crazy. My parents, my parents took me to like the house they grew up in, and it was like nothing like the house I grew up in, obviously. And it was just like how thin the fabric is between like what it would be like for me to have grown up there and like what the opportunities I would have had there and versus like what I grew up in. And like that made me care a lot about like education, like trying to figure out like how to direct resources toward people who like basically just were unlucky and didn't get the privilege of birth that I had gotten. So that was an intuition I had when I was in high school about basically the frailty between like how close people are from where they are to poverty. But similarly, an intuition I had when I came to the fellowship is that there's also a similarly thin boundary between where you are and like, you know, maybe being a billionaire or like being a successful startup founder, right? Like you think there's this huge boundary between you and like someone who's like exited like this $1 billion company or like built this thing from scratch, like has this technical knowledge that you don't have. And similarly, I think that people overestimate what that distance is between where they are right now and this other future that they could be in. So I think that that's probably like the most like fundamental thing I've learned is that like there's this reality now, there's this reality that you want to have, and there's this thin boundary between like you being in poverty and this thin boundary between you potentially being a billionaire. And you just have to kind of understand that like the world is very moldable and the world is very plastic, and that I've learned that I actually have like much more control over directing what the future could potentially be.